Hello, Kim Knight here from kimknighthealth.com, and today we're looking at quite a deep topic, although I'd say most of my webinars are pretty deep, but this is even deeper than usual, and we're going to look at how to get through the dark night of the soul. Just before we start, just as I always do, to say that the information I'm sharing here is from personal experience and from my experience in clinic with clients, but you are absolutely responsible for how you take on this information and how you use it. I do not diagnose, treat, heal, cure any medical condition, and if you need to seek appropriate medical help or assistance, please do so. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at what is the dark night of the soul, and also explaining the difference between the dark night of the soul versus the dark night of the senses. Most people don't realize the difference, and I didn't actually until I heard about this a couple of years ago. And looking at some of the symptoms of the dark nights, whether it's a dark night of the soul or the senses, and why we experience these dark nights, the deeper spiritual meanings and lessons of these dark nights, and then some tips for making it through. So I want to start off by sharing some uncomfortable truths which you may or may not be aware of, and some statistics about suicide. And these are actually a couple of years old, but every 16 minutes a person dies by suicide in the USA. And it's the third leading cause of death in young adults between 15 and 24. And men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than women. Another statistic here, every 2 hours and 11 minutes, a person under the age of 25 dies by suicide. And this was 3 years ago, these statistics, in 2014. So, you know, that may be higher today. So that's 10 people every day. We can change this by understanding maybe at a deeper level of what is really going on, because my sense is that a lot of this information is not really fully understood by either the person going through it or even professionals trying to help people go through it or prevent, you know, suicide. Now, if we look at the planet, apparently, according to Greg Braden, whose seminar I attended earlier this year, over 40% of animal species have become extinct in the last 60 years. I think he may even have said 50 years. Now, you know, there's huge, huge planetary changes going on, but for most of us, we carry on our life as though nothing is happening, especially if we're not, you know, directly affected. We are all indirectly affected, but you know, a lot of us are not living maybe in the depths of Africa or I don't know where, but we're just getting on with our daily lives. But the reality is, you know, there is significant trauma going on for the planet. And Greg Braden says we've crossed the vital ecological thresholds that are necessary for Earth's survival. This was something that he said 2 or 3 years ago. So we know we're really on the brink of crisis, and some people really recognize this and other people are completely oblivious of it. And even if we semi-recognize it, maybe we don't realize how to get on with it. But the point that I'm making here is that what is going on for us personally is also connected with what's going on for the planet. And so the planet is really going through a crisis, and we're being asked to change. And we're also, you know, many people are going through crisis, and these crises are showing up as dark nights of the soul or dark nights of the senses. So despite all of this, one of the things that I've come to learn over the last few years is that despite all appearances, our natural state is to be really calm and to be really relaxed and to be very joyful. And that is actually our natural state. So if you imagine the sun shining and it's there, and the clouds come in the way, once we part the clouds, we return to our natural state. But unfortunately, most of us have got too many clouds. We're just living under the clouds all the time, and these clouds are lots of, negative life events, negative emotions, negative, traumas, life traumas. So we're not experiencing our natural state of joy. And actually, from the research that I've been doing even more recently, what I've discovered is that our natural state is actually to be in what is called a peak experience. And there are many kinds of peak experience. For example, samadhi, enlightenment, these are types of peak experience. And this is actually our natural state. And some consider, people who are researching this information, say that anything less is actually illness. We tend to say, in our society, that illness is, when we have symptoms, but actually not being in a peak state is potentially illness. So this is quite interesting information and research that I've been doing recently. Now, Eckhart Tolle, who you may be familiar with, I think he's a fascinating, amazing man. He says, if we don't find our greater intelligence, we're going to kill ourselves, because the evolutionary level where we're identified with, which is thinking, is no longer functioning well. It has become destructive. It has reached the end of its lifespan or usefulness. But this comes from a course that I'm actually doing right now, The Power of Presence with Eckhart Tolle. He is saying that if we don't change how we think, and not just that, but we don't get in touch with something that is actually beyond thinking, we will not survive as a human species. So, he carries on. There's a little bit more, but there's more later. If humans don't achieve this transition, they will either regress to an earlier stage of development and then have another go, which could take a few 100,000 years, but the universe is patient, or the species, in other words, a human species, becomes extinct and consciousness simply decides to move through other channels to express itself. So let's look at some levels, what we call levels of consciousness. This is a diagram from David Hawkins, who's written many books. I've read most of his books. He was an enlightened teacher who was also a medical doctor. So he had reached self-realization, but he was also a medical doctor. And he created this chart with different levels of consciousness. And he gave each type of consciousness level a rating. So, for example, shame rated 20. Whereas peace was 600 and joy was 540. So as I was saying, our natural state is to be up here, and these peak states are what we call enlightenment, and there are many different types of peak states, so they're rating very, very high, and peace, joy, love are rating very high, and these are, remember, our natural state. But if we're in a dark night of the soul or a dark night of the senses, we're going to be down here. We're going to be in despair, hopelessness, blame, victim, humiliation, shame, guilt, grief, fear. We're going to be down here in what I call below the line. There's a line here in the middle. And I like to call this, we're either operating above the line or below the line. And I spent most of my life operating below the line, not knowing that there even was above the line. And I think this is probably true for a lot of people. And in a moment, I'm going to come to, well, why? Why do we spend all this time below the line rather than above the line in our natural state? So let's look at dark nights. What is a dark night of the soul or the senses? Now, this is just my personal interpretation. I was going to look up and look at the, what does it say on Wikipedia, but I forgot to do that. So you can look that up yourself if you like. But for me personally, and from what I've experienced with clients, it's a very, very challenging life experience or period of time. And it usually goes on for some time. And it tests us to the core. And often we feel like we just don't know how we're going to get through. That would be my description of a dark night of the soul or a dark night of the senses. And I'm actually going to define that even more and define the difference between the two later. But what we're going to feel, whether it's a dark night of the soul or senses, we're going to feel things like overwhelm, despair, hopelessness, confusion, fear. We're going to feel mentally and emotionally fragile. we're going to often be depressed, experience depression. We'll often feel very, very alone, like we're going through it alone and nobody else understands. There may be feelings of wanting to give up, maybe even feelings of like, I'm going crazy, I'm losing my mind. And even to the extreme, which of course is feelings of like, this has just got so bad, I just want to die. And as I showed at the start, many people take that route. So, you know, essentially life sucks. It feels like life sucks when we're in this place. It is not a pleasant place to be. And there are many, many triggers. So on the surface, it could be a health crisis. It's very common, and it was what happened for me. That going through a health crisis triggers all this stuff to come up inside of us. It could be a financial crisis. It could be a relationship crisis, or a family crisis, or a work crisis. Well, basically, we could just say life. Stuff happens in life, and suddenly we find ourselves, or over a period of time, we find ourselves in a life crisis, or a dark night of the soul, or senses. So let's look at some of these causes. We have these developmental stages in life that we have to go through, and if there is trauma during these developmental stages, then that can cause some of, you know, this emotional mental pain. Often people don't realize that when they're going through a deep life crisis, so whatever it is, whether it's a financial crisis or a health crisis, or whatever the crisis is, there's actually a deeper spiritual evolution and transformation going on. And once we understand that this actually may be going on, it helps us to put things in perspective and see the bigger picture, and it somehow is quite comforting and helps us to get through. Some clients that I've worked with, it's become very, very apparent that they are going through a huge spiritual transformation inside of them. But they didn't realize it. They were just focusing on the symptoms, and the physical symptoms, or the emotional and the mental symptoms, and they just think, I'm going mad. But actually, when we're going through a spiritual transformation, the old has to break down to make way for the new. And the metaphor that I always like to give is that if you have a skyscraper, and it's an old skyscraper, and you want to build a new one, you have to demolish the old one first before you can build the new one. Otherwise, there's no space for the new one. And the new one's going to be completely different anyway. It's just going to be brand new. It's going to be, you know, high tech, modern. It's going to be completely different. Or you could say, you know, like operating from the very first Windows, whatever that was, to, you know, Windows 10. It's like this real upgrade that we have of our consciousness. And that is a messy affair. When you demolish a building, it's pretty messy, you know, once you demolish it and you've got all the rubble there and you've got to take it away. So really, when people are going through a really difficult, challenging time in their life, which could be described as a dark night of the senses or a dark night of the soul, then there is maybe spiritual evolution going on, which we could say is akin to human evolution, which is what Eckhart Tolle was talking about. Is like, you know, everything changes, nothing stays the same, and our consciousness is always changing. You know, humans are always evolving. We are not cavemen anymore, and we don't just stay where we are. We have to evolve. And so these life lessons force us to change. And it's not comfortable sometimes. In fact, sometimes it's really, really uncomfortable. And we have to get to this point where we break through. So let's go through some of these different types of traumas individually. So for example, in the first 18 months of our life, as a human being, we need to experience things like feeling loved, feeling cherished, feeling valued, feeling worthy, feeling cared for, feeling validated. These are what are called developmental needs. And psychologists have identified that in the first 18 months, there are about 20 developmental needs that need to be met. In other words, we need to feel cared for, we need to feel loved, we need to feel safe, we need to feel cherished as a human being. And even studies have been done on monkeys and chimpanzees, and they found exactly the same thing. If you take away these things from the growing infant, if you take away safety, if you take away any form of positive recognition, that deeply traumatizes and emotionally scars, if you like, that animal or that person. And that has consequences later in life, because all that emotional scarring is literally stored in the body. It's stored in the cells. It's energetically stored. And sooner or later, as one of my teachers says, the body will present its bill. And so sooner or later, we're going to have to deal with that energy that has been trapped inside of us. So that's just the first 18 months. Then the first 7 years are also altogether a very important time developmentally. Again, we have certain emotional needs that need to be met, that need to be fulfilled. They're quite similar to the first 18 months. They're sort of like a continuance, if you like. And we just need to feel this love. We need to feel this sense of safety. But if you're, for example, growing up in a family, and I'm working with clients all the time in this type of scenario, if you grew up in a family where there's, say, violence or abuse, or, you know, you're either watching your parents abusing each other, or you're being abused either emotionally or physically or even sexually, this creates trauma, and it stops proper development of our psyche, of our emotions, of our mind. And all the trauma and the shock and the emotions, they get stored inside the body. They get stored energetically. They literally get stored at a quantum level, at a cellular level. And sooner or later, we're going to have to deal with this. And I'm going to share in a moment of some times where, the key times where this trauma is going to come up in our life to be dealt with and to be healed and resolved. Now, the birth trauma, the actual birth process, is also a key time for the creation of trauma. Now, if we have a beautiful birth where, you know, it's a very lovely, calm, relaxed environment, you know, it's maybe relatively pain-free, even for some people who really clear their stuff before they give birth, they can experience it as an ecstatic, orgasmic experience. But not, this is not, you know, maybe the norm for a lot of people. But if we have a happy, healthy birth where everything is, you know, we come into a room where there's a lot of love, and we're received into the world with safety and love, then that is a really good start. And it has what we call a limbic imprint. It creates a limbic imprint in our brain, whereby our first experience once we're born, or as we're being born, is the experience that we take of how life will be. And so if we have this happy, safe, nurturing, loving birth experience, then we come into the world and we think the world is a safe place, we feel good about ourselves. This limbic imprint is automatically created unconsciously, automatically. But if we have a traumatic birth, then that's a whole different story. And the limbic imprint is still made, but this time it's a completely different limbic imprint, and it's one of fear, one of struggle, one of survival. It's not safe in the world. It's not safe to come into the world. It's not safe to be in the world, and I'm afraid. And you know, examples of that would be if one is circumcised after birth. That's a very traumatic experience for a baby, or cesarean births, or births which are forced in some way. So this was one of the experiences that I had, whereby my mother was induced early, because the doctor back in the 60s, you know, when they did this sort of thing, doctor wanted to go away early on holiday, something like that. And so she was induced because it was convenient to him. But can you imagine, I was there in her womb, not ready to come out. She wasn't ready as a mother to give birth. And so they forced the whole thing. And it ended up that I was 2 or 3 weeks early, and then I was left in hospital, put in an incubator. Now that created a lot of negative limbic imprint, which I'm still working through. I've worked through some of it, but there's still some remaining, and I can tell you it's intense. It is set a fundamental foundation for my beliefs, and this is why I do the work I do, because I've been through it or going through it myself. And if I can help anybody else to get through these traumas and clear them, then, you know, that is very satisfying. So birth trauma is a huge unspoken about, unknown about topic, which I am very passionate about sharing. Also, from the research I've been doing more recently, we have developmental trauma in the uterus, in the womb, as we are growing, and actually literally from even before the sperm and the egg come together. There are certain developmental events in this process of the sperm and the egg and coming together and then becoming a zygote and then implanting in the wall of the uterus and growing, and there are certain developmental events that happen during that time. And if there is some sort of trauma, and a trauma could be considered for the egg, for example, of like hitting the uterus wall too hard, that can be registered as a trauma. So it's more like a physical trauma, but at a very microscopic level. But believe it or not, these developmental traumas that happen in the womb, they cause us to lose these peak states, or these natural peak states of consciousness once we're born. This is very fascinating stuff. This is the latest research. I've only just been literally researching this and learning about it in the last couple of months. So this is quite new to me, but it's really blowing my mind as to actually what creates trauma. So, you know, these things, they go very, very deep. Also, from an astrological planetary perspective, there is a thing called a Saturn return. Now, planets orbiting the sun, and different planets take different amounts of time to orbit the sun. Now, I'm not really clued up on astrology, but I know enough about it to know that, you know, that the placement of the planets has an effect. So, for example, I mean, we know this, right? The tides and the moon, and the full moon, and the, you know, we sort of know this, but we don't really know the full extent of it unless you're really clued into astrology. For example, when you're born, all the planets are in a very specific place in the heavens, or whatever people like to call it. And that creates, you know, when you go to an astrologer, they'll say, oh yes, well, your moon was here and your sun was there in the 4th house, and the, you know, honestly, I really don't know that much about it, but I do get that significantly influences our personality. And the whole thing really about real astrology is about moving from what we call our personality to our soul. So growing from a personality to our soul, evolving ourselves from personality to soul. But I'm just taking one of these astrological influences, which is quite a strong influence, which is the Saturn return. So every 28 years, Saturn revolves around the sun. And so 28, 56, 84 would be rough, you know, those 28-year periods. And what happens is when we hit one of those 28-year periods, whatever is in our unconscious or in our psyche that has not been resolved or cleared comes up to be looked at and to be dealt with. And this is when we can have these, you know, dark nights of the senses, dark nights of the soul experiences. Now, I didn't know this when I had my first one. So my first one was when I was 28. I had no idea. I was diagnosed with clinical depression. I found myself in hospital. I had a breakdown. I had no idea what was going on. It took me several years to work out what had really gone on. And actually what had gone on in that period of time, which was like about a year, was that I had an awakening, what is called an awakening. So I went from a very asleep, unconscious, totally unconscious person who really did not know anything about herself to starting to wake up. That didn't mean I was realized or enlightened. That's way ahead. No, it meant I just was shaken and woken up. It took me several years to piece all the pieces of the puzzle together, but that was definitely what happened. And now I'm actually 56 and I'm going through another one, and I can tell you it is very uncomfortable. So it's good to know this. It doesn't happen exactly on the 28. It could be 27, 28, 29, but this is very common. So, you know, just check out, you know, what happened when I was 28, or check out, you know, what age am I now? Could this be what's happening, because whatever is unresolved and uncleared and stuck, it's going to have to move and clear. Now, also there's in Indian astrology, there's an event called a Rahu Ketu. And again, I don't know this in detail, but I'll just share my experience. When I was getting well, which took me 10 years to get over chronic fatigue, I was unable to work in that time. And I was searching, trying lots of different therapies. And I went to an Indian astrology evening. And there was only a few of us that arrived. And the guy who was giving the talk said, well, since there's only so few of you, I'll plot all of your astrology and see what's going on for you. Now, he'd never met any of us. He didn't know any details about us at all. So he plotted in my date of birth, etc., whatever he needed. And he said, that's really interesting. You have a Rahu Ketu. And that means that your Ketu is on one side of the earth and your Rahu is on the other, something like that, and something to do with the snake. And you're going to have health problems for another X number of years. I can't remember how many years he said, but he was right, because I was ill at the time. He had no idea I was ill. And it was about that time, it was either 3 years later or something like that, that I became well. So I thought that was quite fascinating. Now, here's a really interesting thing. Yugas. So a yuga is a huge span of time, and the Indians, in India, they have incredible history and understanding of spiritual matters and human matters. And for example, one day and night of Brahma is 24 million years. We have these huge spans of time which go round and round and round. And every 24,000 years, there's one revolution of the solar system around the North Star and the grand central sun. This information I gleaned from Sri Yukteswar, who is a self-realized Kriya Yoga master, in his book, The Holy Science. And he talks about the developmental mental virtue, or the development of our mind in relation to these yugas, or these huge spans of time. And there are 4 yugas or spans of time. And for example, the Kali Yuga, which means Dark Ages, was 499 to 1599 AD. And then the Dwapara Yuga started 1900 and goes to 3900. So as you can see, we are still only in the Dwapara Yuga, and in fact, we're about here in 2017. Now, the Satya Yuga is the Golden Age, and the Kali Yuga is the Dark Ages. So we have to remember that, as a planetary consciousness, where we stand at the moment, is that we're only just come out of the Dark Ages. And we're in the second sort of tier here. And so from a planetary perspective and human consciousness perspective, we're still working our way up the ladder. But, it's good to just see where we are in the much, much bigger cosmic scheme of things, which, interests me, because again, it puts things in perspective. The reason we're going through so much personal and planetary shit, for want of a better word, is because we're here. And I just read you a little bit about the Kali Yuga and the Dwapara Yuga. In the Kali Yuga, which is the Dark Ages, the mental virtue is in its first stage, and it's only a quarter developed. And the human intellect cannot comprehend anything beyond the gross material. In other words, beyond the physical. It's basically just focused on the physical. And then we start moving into the Dwapara Yuga, where we're at sort of at the bottom end of that. And the mental virtue is in the second stage of development. It can comprehend fine matters or electricities and their attributes, which it's a bit esoteric, but, it's developing. So, once we get up to the Satya Yuga, which is the Golden Age, the human intellect can comprehend everything, even God and the spirit, beyond this visible world. Now, anybody who's in an enlightened state they're already there, right? They're already comprehending that level of existence, which most humans on the planet right now are not comprehending. Now, coming back to these causes of these dark nights, ancestral and karmic influences. So ancestral is, obviously our ancestors, grandparents, great-grandparents, and think how many lineages back, our family ancestral line goes, like, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. And energetically, information is passed through. It is passed through to us from our ancestors. So sometimes we have to clear at this level when we're healing. And karmically, we may have other lives. Now, I know that I'm going into real esoteric territory here, and for some people listening, you're going to go, wow, I don't understand this, she's mad, and you'll switch off, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. For other people listening, you're going to go, oh, wow, this is really interesting, and this is starting to make sense of things. And that, whether we're in the this is mad, she's mad, or whether this is really interesting camp, that will all depend, in my experience, to whether we're ready to hear this information. Now, for example, before my awakening, when I was 28, I was not ready to hear this. In fact, I wasn't ready to hear it after. I was 28 when that happened. I came to New Zealand when I was 30, and I moved into a flat with this girl, and we got on really, really well. And she handed me Louise Hay's book, You Can Heal Your Life. And she said, wow, I've just read this amazing book. It's really interesting. Do you want to borrow it? And I looked at it, opened the front page, read the first few words, couldn't understand a word. It was in English, but I couldn't understand a word. My consciousness was not ready to grasp the information that she was showing me. And I said, well, thanks very much, but no thanks. A year later, I came across that book. I think it was less than a year, 9 months maybe. I saw the book in a bookshop and picked it up again, opened up the page, started to read it. It all made sense, and I bought the book. Now, what had changed? The book hadn't changed. My consciousness had shifted. So if anything that I'm talking about today just feels really out of the box, beyond your comfort zone or level of acceptability, of believability, that's absolutely fine. But some people will be ready to hear this. So all the teachers, the spiritual teachers that I have learned from, they all say the same thing. They say we have other lives. I don't personally have memories of this, and from the research that, from the research that I've been doing recently, part of that is because of the developmental events that happened in utero, which are blocking me, quite intelligently, I'm sure, from experiencing past lives at this point in time. But every spiritual teacher I've heard says that we have other lives, and that so when we come into this life, we bring with us the karma or the effects of other lives. And some people say that these lives are happening simultaneously as well. So, I mean, it's a big, complex subject, which I'm not educated enough to talk on in depth, but I'm very open to it. It feels right, it feels true, and so I'm open to it. But the point of this is that when we're going through shit, excuse my French, in this life, it's often to do with these karmic influences or these ancestral influences. So there's this bigger picture the whole time that we have to keep looking at of, why is everything so difficult? And the whole point of karma is it's to do with the law of cause and effect, that everything we do has an effect. So if we do something nice, later down the track, something nice comes back to us. If we do something not so nice, then something not so nice comes back to us. So it's all karma, because there is this equaling law of the universe that says everything has to equal itself out. And then once we've done that, then we can start moving up these levels of consciousness. And as I've already mentioned, one of the things that can be going on is what's called an awakening, a spiritual awakening, or some people call it a spiritual emergency. And, this may be what's going on for a lot of people, so it's good to know. Now, I want to go on and talk a bit about the journey of the Fool. Now, in the tarot, which you may be familiar with, the journey of the Fool through the world is, the Fool is an unenlightened person living in the world of illusion or Maya. And so this journey of the tarot is really the journey of the Fool moving through the world and growing and evolving in consciousness. This is really what the tarot is about. And I've learnt this deeper meaning of the tarot from my colleague and also mentor, Russell Sturgis, and he's written a wonderful book called Metanoia. Well, metanoia means the healing of the heart. So really, you know, we have to heal these hurts in our heart. And these hurts go very deep. As you can see, it could be in uterus, it could be in the first 18 months, it could be from another life. So he says in his book, the journey as depicted by the Trumps sees the Fool traveling through two worlds. The first is the illusory world. Here the Fool seeks possessions, power and popularity as the treasures of his heart in order to validate his existence. The first 10 cards illustrate the drama and struggle the Fool experiences as he learns of the illusory nature of this world. The second part represents the real world and the place where the Fool experiences relationship with the divine. In order to enter the real world, the Fool must leave behind all the things of the illusory world. Unable to let this world go, the Fool keeps going around in the same circle, having to re-experience the drama of illusory world over and over again. To move on, the Fool has to pass through the portal of the dark night of the soul, replacing the material treasures of his heart with the spiritual treasures of peace, joy, and justice. So, you know, we're going up to those higher levels of consciousness that I showed on the chart earlier. Now, this is also, you know, what's really going on in the Matrix. It's like they're in this world of illusion, and then they go to the world of reality, which actually isn't initially a pleasant place to be, because he's got to go through this huge dark night of the soul experience. So he continues in the book, the Fool is forced to question what is real. In many cases, the Fool is forced to relinquish the trappings of the illusory world, either through sickness or ruin. And as I was saying before, often it could be deep, you know, significant traumatic health issues or financial issues that can trigger us to go through these dark night of the senses or dark night of the soul. So I just want to talk about the difference between the dark night of the senses and the dark night of the soul, which I didn't know until I read this book and spoke with Russell. So the Fool has to pass certain tests before he can enter the temple and thereby prove his worthiness. This part of the journey can take years or even lifetimes, and it can also happen in the twinkling of an eye. This part of the journey demands that the Fool relinquishes his will for the will of God. Now, that's talking about the dark night of the soul. So the difference between the dark night of the soul and the dark night of the senses is that the dark night of the senses is just these life challenges, which can be quite difficult and quite extreme, but they don't really take us to a spiritual perspective. Whereas a dark night of the soul ends up with complete surrender to the divine, and thy will be done. Now, I know I'm talking, you know, almost like pseudo-religious language here. This is just this tradition's way of presenting this information. But you can go to any different religious tradition and you will find them saying the same thing in their different way. You know, whether you go to Catholicism or you go to the, you know, Vedic texts in India or the Eastern, you know, Japanese, Chinese, you know, way, they're all saying the same thing. They just have a different way of saying it. So this is just this particular way of saying it. So the Fool has entered the portal of the dark night of the soul by experiencing his dark night of the senses. So in other words, we can be going through a dark night of the senses, and that triggers us into a dark night of the soul. The senses are referred to as the fingers of the soul, and the Fool has to go through disassociating with the senses of time so that he can begin to heighten his spiritual sensitivity. Being more familiar with the gross stimulation of the senses, the Fool had been unable to hear the still small voice. that has been constantly arising from within. He has to turn off his physical senses in order to be attuned to the more delicate sense of intuition. Now, all spiritual traditions, they all say that to really find ourselves, we have to go inwards. We have to close our senses, which are the eyes, the ears, etc. And we have to go inwards. And this is where we find our true self. Whether you want to call it true self, higher self, God, divine, whatever word you want to use, we have to go inside. It is not going to be found outside in the illusory world. And of course, most of us are brought up with, we're living in this world and we're busy with our lives and our work, and we have very little time to go inwards. But when we go through a dark night of the soul and everything just falls apart, everything gets so bad that we are forced finally to go inwards to find the answers and to transcend our personality and to reconnect with our divinity, which has always been there, but we've just been disconnected from. Well, not true, we can never be really disconnected from it, but we're just not aware of it consciously. So where the experience of switching off the physical senses can be referred to as the dark night of the senses, the process of heightening intuition is the dark night of the soul. The distinction between the two experiences is important because only the dark night of the soul has the fool truly enter the kingdom of heaven, leaving behind the world of illusion. This is like complete transformation and transcendence. Many people experience dark nights of the senses, but it does not have them seek to develop a relationship with God. This is what I was saying before, is that we can have a really, really challenging life situation, people dying, terrible financial situation, but somehow we get through that and then we just sort of carry on with our life. Whereas when things get really so bad, we just surrender to something bigger than ourselves. So having been chastened through their sensory dark night, they might adjust their values and behavior to be more responsible in how they engage their senses, but they are no closer to developing right relationship with God. Or we could say that, the dark night of the senses is like a lesser version of the dark night of the soul. The fool has no choice about the journey, although he does have a choice about how long he takes to experience it. Eventually, he has to die to the illusionary treasures of his heart, as it is the only way to allow in the treasures of God. So, often this is what is happening and what is being asked of us when we're going through these really, really deep, dark, difficult life circumstances, and we are being asked and in a way forced to go inwards and to find this part of us that we have disconnected from. And a lot of people, I would say, do not realize this, or they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to get there. And this is why it is so important, from my experience, to have spiritual practices. We have to have many different ways of getting through these dark nights. But when if we're going through a dark night of the soul, we are going to need spiritual practices. We will not get there without them. As I said earlier from Eckhart Tolle, he said, human beings are completely identified with their mind. Their whole sense of self is derived from mind activity. The awakening of consciousness is the realization that beyond your mind is a great depth to who you are and great freedom and a far greater intelligence than is in your thinking mind. So most people spend most of their time in their thinking mind, but they don't realize that there's this hugely greater intelligence, which you could call, like Eckhart Tolle calls it, unconditioned consciousness. Some people call it God, divine, whatever word you want to use. But it is there, sitting there, waiting for us to connect with it. But we have to go beyond, our thinking mind to get there, which is why we need these spiritual practices. Then the thinking mind can be used by that greater intelligence. But for the thinking mind to be used by that greater intelligence, you have to find within yourself that greater intelligence, which we could call unconditioned consciousnness. You have to find this within yourself. And in our Qigong or Ren Shui human life science training, this is our teacher refers to this as the false self compared to the true self. So we have this false self, which is the personality, as opposed to the false master and the true master. So the false master is our personality, and the true master is this unconditioned consciousness, which is far more powerful and enormous and humongous compared to our mind. And Eckhart continues, if we don't find it, in other words, this greater intelligence, we're going to kill ourselves, because this evolutionary level where we are identified with thinking is no longer functioning well. And he's talking about this is right now, 2017. It has become destructive. It has reached the end of its lifespan or usefulness. If humans don't achieve the transition, they will either regress to an earlier stage of development and then have another go, which could take a few 100,000 years, but the universe is patient, or the species becomes extinct and consciousness simply decides to move through other channels to express itself. So what I've really said up until now is that we can have these really, really difficult dark nights, life challenges, life crises, but there is a much bigger picture as to why they're happening. And if we can understand and work through these deeper reasons, then we're much more likely to come through. And we're also need to recognize this much, much bigger perspective of what's going on from, I would call it a spiritual perspective. And that also helps us to come through. So because of time, I'm going to go through the solutions in part 2 next week. But before I leave, I just want to share a few things that are happening right now that may be of interest. Part 1 and all these webinars do get put on my YouTube channel later anyway. But right now, there's a brand new film out called Lifestyle Medicine, which is all about how 80% of illness, at least, can be prevented or reversed without medication, without surgery, without supplements, just by going inside and understanding the deeper meaning, these deeper emotional causes of illness. So if you'd like to watch that, it is free, it is online. You just go to kimknighthealth.com and it's on the homepage, and you just click on the link and register for the film. When you register for the film, you'll also get free access to the Lifestyle Medicine Summit, which is 30 world experts talking about how we can reverse illness naturally in this new paradigm. So this is the arena of medicine that I've been working in for the last 12 years, studying for the last 25 years, but working as a therapist for the last 12 years. And my passion is to teach people how they can transform themselves mentally, emotionally, physically, from the inside out without external intervention. And this is a new paradigm of healthcare, which is growing and needs to grow more and more, and will grow more and more as our consciousness evolves. So you can sign up for that on the same page, kimknighthealth.com. And hopefully soon I'll be interviewing Russell on my new online TV series, and be talking to him about this journey of the Fool, which is very, very fascinating, and also the process that he takes people through to evolve their consciousness. And next week, I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Leslie Wells on Eve consciousness, which is a new consciousness birthing itself on the planet at the moment, and talking about her new book, Path to Wealth Through Faith. So I really appreciate you joining me. I'm sorry that we don't have time for any Q&A today, just because I started a little late and I've had to split it into 2 anyway. So I look forward to seeing you on part 2. Have a great day.